After months of hard work, the crew of the Kinloch Bravo oil rig in the North Sea is finally ready to return home. Magnus, the rig manager, is getting a call from the company with bad news. Helicopters are diverting to assist the North Kilscour platform with its power outage, so it's unclear when they'll be able to pick up Magnus' crew. Magnus wishes to inquire further, but the phone abruptly stops working. Kat's phone call with her wife hangs up, and Fulmer is unable to get the main radio to work. Magnus convenes a meeting and informs them that they will have to wait a while before returning home. This is not well received by anyone, especially Lars, who continues to demand proper explanations. Suddenly, the power goes out throughout the building, and Fulmer discovers that all of the generators have failed. For the time being, the battery backup is holding things together, and the production module is holding its pressure, but if it spikes, it could kill them all. Fulmer tries to contact the standby vessel, but the radio is still down, and the other oil platform nearby appears to be having the same problem. The entire rig begins to shake, and the production module begins to catch fire and burn out of control. Rose, the company representative, is reluctant to shut it down because they will be far short of quota, but Magnus orders his men to do so anyway for the sake of their lives. At that point, the entire rig begins to shake again. Everyone is taken aback when they notice a thick, fast-moving fog engulfing the entire structure. Fulmer restores power moments later, but communications remain down, and the choppers are unlikely to arrive in this weather. Alwyn wonders if they haven't drilled too deeply and caused a seismic event, but Rose, a scientist, assures him that this isn't the case. Magnus believes that repairing communications is their top priority, so he dispatches Fulmer and Baz to inspect the radio tower. When they reach the top, Fulmer starts checking the machine, but he loses his cool when Baz accuses him of betraying the team by dating Rose, who is on the company's side rather than theirs. When Fulmer lets go of Baz, he moves to pick something up and discovers a dead seagull on the floor. Magnus and Lars are waiting at the bottom of the tower when they notice Baz fall. Kat and Rose rush to the scene with a medical kit, while Fulmer arrives as well, explaining that he has no idea what happened because Baz was right behind him. Lars is skeptical of his story because Baz's harness is unclipped. Kat transports Bax to the medical bay and stabilizes him, but she can't do anything else without a surgery room. Lars begins to lose it because the choppers will not arrive in time. Rose takes Magnus to the computer to show him that the pipelines have no pressure, implying that all the rigs in the area are experiencing the same problem. Baz awakens moments later and begins having visions of things falling apart beneath the sea. Lars goes to Magnus' office to blame him for everything, but Magnus dismisses his complaints and walks away. This allows Lars to snoop around his desk and discover a private memo from the company, which enrages him. He gathers everyone on the Helidic to inform them that management has been deceiving them from the beginning. Magnus arrives and sees Lars has the memo, so he has to admit that the company is scrapping the entire field and everyone will lose their jobs soon. The conversation is abruptly cut short by something falling on them, ash, despite the fact that they are not near a volcano. Baz also arrives at the Helidic and declares, "It's too late, it's already started," before passing out. Later, Baz awakens in the infirmary and claims he has no recollection of the accident or the Helidic. He saw something in the fog at the tower and heard a noise in his head. When Kat tries to take blood, Baz reacts violently and yells at them for not listening to his warnings about a coming wave. Kat explains to Rose that Baz's wounds are healing on their own after she manages to put him to sleep. When the women leave, Baz reveals that he is still awake, and when he examines his wounds, he notices some glowing spores working to close them. The crew notices some lights by the window in the rec room. It's the standby vessel, which is attempting to communicate but is also heading in the wrong direction. Alwyn sends Lek outside to retrieve the Morse message, and they discover the vessel is requesting assistance. Magnus instructs Fulmer to sign back to them using the deck lights to find out what they know, after which he goes to see Cook Murch and requests that rationing of their food begin. Lars is going insane because he is locked in his room with Easter guarding the door. When Baz wakes up in the infirmary, he notices that most of his injuries have healed, and when he checks his reflection, he begins to have visions of the rig being destroyed. Then he flees to his room, where he begins wriggling in pain as his mouth pushes out his gold tooth. Rose gathers some ash for analysis and instructs everyone to remain inside. Fulmer tells her and Magnus that the ship has no more information than they do. They don't have communications either, so if they wait until morning, they won't be able to use the lights to guide them in, and the boat may capsize. If they evacuate, it should be now, but Rose is reluctant because it could land them in legal trouble for breach of contract. Magnus' priority is everyone's safety, so he asks Fulmer to keep the lights on to guide the vessel slowly. When Alwyn goes outside to take over Lek's shift, he notices Baz drawing strange circles on a window. When Baz checks on him, he explains that his head is buzzing and that he shouldn't have survived the accident. Something is definitely not normal about this situation. The lights in the room begin to flicker, and Baz has another strange vision before fleeing. Lars begins working on the window and is able to remove it from the wall in order to escape. Lex sneaks into the infirmary to get drunk on rubbing alcohol, then tries to take a shower. At that point, his body begins to hurt all over, and as Lex vomits blood, the ink from his tattoos begins to peel away from his skin. He's already dead when Heather finds him. Kat can't tell what killed him when she comes to check on him, but when Dunlin shows up with Baz's tooth, she knows something is pushing inorganic material out of their bodies. Fulmer notices a light on the bridge that does not come from the vessel while in the control room. He and Alwyn go outside to investigate, but Lars notices them and switches off his flashlight before they can apprehend him. He sneaks back into the building and locks the door they used, bumping into Heather on the way. Fulmer and Alwyn inspect the rowboats to see if anyone is attempting to escape, and Fulmer inadvertently injures his hand. The ash mysteriously stops falling at that point. Lars enters the control room and begins signaling Sauce with the lights, causing the ship to accelerate to full speed. When Alwyn and Fulmer see the message, they try to return inside. But the door is locked, so Alwyn goes looking for another way in while Fulmer continues to shout. Heather hears him and summons Magnus to assist her in opening the door. When Fulmer tells them about Lars, they rush to stop him, nearly starting a fistfight, before Magnus tells them to focus on sending a message to the vessel to correct its course. Alwyn's currently following some lights flickering that lead him to Baz, who refuses to come back because he needs to see the life in the water that started it all. Alwyn insists, and Baz snaps, grabbing Alwyn and forcing him to spit water out of his mouth. When Dunlin arrives to warn them about an impending wave caused by the boat's change of course, Baz drops Alwyn and flees. Dunlin pulls Alwyn's body from the water, and Magnus arrives to assist with CPR, but it's too late. When Kat arrives, she confirms that Alwyn drowned. Rose continues to examine the ash, and when she drops a drop of blood on it, she confirms the presence of living organisms. She visits Magnus, who informs her that the vessel has left to assist another rig first. Rose takes him and Kat to her office to explain that the ash contains a parasitic spore that is looking for hosts, and quickly heals their wounds because it wants a healthy body. They must avoid prolonged ash exposure and keep an eye on people with open wounds. Magnus gives Rose permission to collect blood samples from the entire crew and compare them to what they have from Baz. Heather notices in the mess hall that the fog has finally lifted and that the neighboring rig has been completely destroyed. Fulmer notices Baz looking at Rose's research and offers to help, but Baz declines because the light requires him. Rose arrives and notices Baz has taken his own blood sample, so he flees when she asks for his cooperation. When Magnus learns what happened, he orders Kat to check on everyone who has been injured because the testing is no longer possible. Alwyn insists, and Baz snaps, grabbing Alwyn and forcing him to spit water out of his mouth. When Dunlin arrives to warn them about an impending wave caused by the boat's change of course, Baz drops Alwyn and flees. Dunlin pulls Alwyn's body from the water, and Magnus arrives to assist with CPR, but it's too late. When Kat arrives, she confirms that Alwyn drowned. Rose continues to examine the ash, and when she drops a drop of blood on it, she confirms the presence of living organisms. She visits Magnus, who informs her that the vessel has left to assist another rig first. Rose takes him and Kat to her office to explain that the ash contains a parasitic spore that is looking for hosts, and quickly heals their wounds because it wants a healthy body. They must avoid prolonged ash exposure and keep an eye on people with open wounds. Magnus gives Rose permission to collect blood samples from the entire crew and compare them to what they have from Baz. Heather notices in the mess hall that the fog has finally lifted and that the neighboring rig has been completely destroyed. Fulmer notices Baz looking at Rose's research and offers to help, but Baz declines because the light requires him. Rose arrives and notices Baz has taken his own blood sample, so he flees when she asks for his cooperation. When Magnus learns what happened, he orders Kat to check on everyone who has been injured because the testing is no longer possible. James, terrified, hits Dunlin and flees. When the rig loses power again, Magnus takes Fulmer out of isolation to force him to fix it. Heather notices Baz and follows him into the mud pit, where he is growing plants everywhere. Baz explains that a million-year-old memory has told him that he must defend this place because it is under attack, and that if it dies, everyone will perish with it. Suddenly, James appears, having joined Baz's cause. When the rest of the team realizes Heather is missing, Lars arrives to rescue her, forcing Baz and James to flee before Heather can get more answers. Fulmer is able to restore power, and the team notices that the flare on the production module has vanished. They need to disconnect it from the power supply to prevent it from exploding, but the module control is in the mud pit, where they could become infected by the spores. Their only option is to manually relight the flare, and Fulmer is willing to take the risk. Easter manipulates the crane to bring Fulmer closer to the module, but this is insufficient, so Fulmer unclips his harness and gets as close to the module as possible for a proper shot. The flare is successfully turned back on, but Fulmer is burned and must be taken to the infirmary for treatment of serious burns on his back. In the mud pit, Baz's visions get worse and he comes to the conclusion they need to shut down the rig's system to stop the attack. James tries to close the valve, but the pipes are still under pressure and could blow up, so they'll enter the system from the beginning. Later, after receiving a visit from Rose, Fulmer swears he feels fine and gets dressed to assist. He, Rose, and Heather start working on the research together, and Fulmer unconsciously draws some circles on a pad, just like Baz used to. Suddenly, Magnus summons everyone to the control room, where he discovers that the pressure is extremely high due to Baz's attempt to bypass the well's safeties. Fulmer can't take control of the Bullseye ROV remotely, so they'll have to take a chance. Easter pilots the ROV and captures underwater images that show how the earthquakes have created a series of circles on the land that resemble Fulmer's drawings. The ROV approaches the wellhead with caution and shuts it down, infuriating Baz because his plan has failed. He tries to access the system directly from the CPU, but it has an alarm, which Fulmer must disable. Easter's phone suddenly receives a message, and the crew realizes communications have been restored. Magnus attempts to contact the Coast Guard, while Fulmer searches the meaning of the circles that appear to be communicating something. Rose searches the company's system for some containers Heather discovered that no one knew about, only to come across a project called Siren that she is unable to access. She also comes across Fulmer's drawings. Kat calls her wife, who informs her that the company informed the families that the crew is fine and that they have been experiencing electrical problems. At that point, the fog descends on the city, leaving those on land without power. The internet connection goes down, and the guard does not receive Magnus' messages requesting assistance. Baz uses his spore's powers to connect with Fulmer's body, causing him to heal faster. Fulmer also begins to hear Baz's voice in his head, prompting him to rush to the bathroom to examine his wounds. Rose notices he's gone missing and goes to check on him, startling Fulmer because he sees Baz in the mirror for a brief moment. He tells Rose everything, and she comforts him by kissing him. This causes Fulmer to see her suffering and Baz's apparition pleading with him to join him. Rose returns hours later to check on Fulmer, only to discover a note he left behind. Rosa pursues him, and Kat joins her. Together, they discover Fulmer on his way to the mud pit. The girls enter the pit as well, and the spores approach Kat but do not attack. Instead, they circle her stomach because they are intrigued by the baby. Rose drags Kat out before things worsen, and they discover the crew excited because a series of lights are approaching the rig. It's a ship approaching from the nearby rig. The survivors are welcomed by the crew, and Rose meets Coke, who works for the company's research division and demands to be taken to the control room right away. Easter is surprised to see his old flame Harish among them as Kat checks on the other men to make sure there aren't any injuries. Coke explains that his rig exploded due to a pressure failure and that he believes they should prioritize regaining access to the production module. Rose is curious as to why Coke was sent to the rig, but he refuses to explain. Harish tells a different story about Easter in the hospital. When Coke arrived at the rig, he sent a number of people home, leaving the rest to assist him in installing new equipment. They weren't extracting oil from the well, but rather sending something down. Then the fog came in, and people began to vanish, but Coke remained calm, as if he had done this before. He continued to push the equipment test while ignoring pressure warnings until the rig exploded. Heather logs into the system to compare the list of survivors to the crew files, but she can't find Coke's name. She informs Easter and Harish of this, and Harish explains that Coke had been accessing the system using a temporary account created by the IT guy when he arrived. He wiped everything related to the test before they left the rig. Heather checks the system, and Harish points to a strange name that wasn't on the crew list before. There are emails informing the company that the organism has already spread, implying that Coke was always known and sent on purpose. Kat checks on Rose and notices that the circles she's studying resemble a tree, which leads Rose to believe that this is how the spores keep track of time. The gap between the rings represents the 5 major mass extinction events, implying that the last ring is the present and is closing in on them quickly. Coke explains that's exactly what happened in his rig, with the infected people opening the well to blow it up. He wants to send a team to the production module, but Magnus refuses, and Rose suspects that all those containers and testing are part of the secret Project Siren. Fulmer eventually joins Baz and James, but he notices that his mind is clearer than those of his friends. Baz explains that he hasn't had enough exposure to the spores yet, but they'll take over soon. If Fulmer agrees to deal with the system, Baz can assist him in harnessing them. Fulmer gets to work, but it will take some time to silence the alarm. Dunlin, Lars, and Murch request a private meeting with Coke because they are tired of Magnus' bad decisions and want to hear Coke's ideas. Coke explains that they can stop Baz by using the carbon dioxide from the secret containers to knock him out. All they have to do is enter the mud pit and connect the carbon dioxide to the ventilation system. when the trio removes the canisters from the containers. Dunlin becomes suspicious because the label states that the carbon dioxide has been mixed with something else. They carry the canisters to the mud pit and connect them to the ventilation shafts while wearing masks. Baz dispatches James and Fulmer to investigate, and James arrives first, only to vomit blood on them. The guys realize that the carbon dioxide isn't knocking James out, but rather killing him in the plants, which was Coke's intention all along. Lars and Murch flee, but Dunlin refuses to join them until he is certain James cannot be safe. Fulmer tries to turn off the ventilation, but he and Baz both pass out. Kat discovers Coke in the control room, closing the doors around the mud pit after Lars and Murch escape, trapping Dunlin inside. Dunlin dies when his mask runs out of oxygen. Heather and Harish inform Rose and Magnus about Coke and go to confront him, but Coke justifies his actions as necessary for survival. Magnus unlocks the doors but is unable to gain access to the ventilation pits. So Rose goes down there and borrows a mask from Lars in order to enter the mud pit. She manually turns off the ventilation and then checks on Fulmer, who doesn't wake up when Rose shares the mask. When she accidentally touches the plants, the spores react and restore Fulmer's consciousness. They escape the pit together as Baz awakens and the final ring closes underwater. Magnus meets with Harish to learn the truth. Coke pushed the testing to the limit in order to destroy the spore, and losing the rig was just collateral damage in order to survive. The vessel arrived to rescue them, but it crashed, so they wiped the system and fled on a small lifeboat, leaving people behind to perish. Magnus then interrogates Coke, who explains that this is all company policy. They don't want to lose their valuable oil reserves. They just want to keep drilling uninterrupted, so Coke was dispatched to exterminate the spore. If they don't stop it now, it will spread throughout the world. They must kill every infected person in order to survive. Magnus discusses their options with Rose, who believes that killing the infected will have no effect, so she will work with Fulmer to find an alternative. Perhaps Fulmer, like Baz, can communicate with the spore and explain that they could cooperate instead of attacking each other. Baz senses the spore is cutting him off in the pit, and another earthquake hits the rig. Fulmer connects to Baz using a small plant and discovers that the spores are attempting to trigger the next great slide that will wipe the ocean clean. Rose points out that because the spore is a living network threaded throughout the seafloor all over the world, attacking it here will have little effect. She believes they should talk to Baz about stopping the spore through his bond. Magnus would rather work with Coke to stop it, but the others agree with Rose's theory, and Magnus agrees to let them try. Magnus, Rose, and Fulmer enter the pit, where Magnus continues to see his dead son. They find Baz crying in a spore cloud, telling them it's too late and that he failed. Coke searches for Harish, explaining that choppers are already on their way and that he'll bring Harish and his boyfriend if he helps him complete his mission. Harish suspects Coke intends to blow up the rig to cover it up, so he secretly activates the microphones before forcing Coke to admit everything for everyone to hear over the speakers. The earthquakes intensify, and the entire structure collapses. Coke hits Harish to get him out of the way and start the countdown to the explosion, which is when the choppers finally make contact with them. Coke flees to the Helitic to escape alone, and Kat and Heather pursue him while Easter assists Harish in preventing the impending explosion. Coke arrives at the Helitic to find Lars waiting for him, intending to kill him for vengeance, but the girls arrive just in time to stop him. Harish appears to announce that he has stopped the explosion and that everyone should prepare to evacuate, and Lars punches Coke before joining the crew. Rose notices the spore acting strangely in the pit and touches it. She communicates with the spore, but before she can ask it to help humanity, the rig is hit by the worst earthquake yet, and the guys drag her out. Baz decides to stay behind to show the spore that humans can also give. Magnus, Rose, and Fulmer catch the last helicopter and flee just as a tsunami hits the rig, bringing it down just as Baz becomes one with the spore. Kat notices the approaching tsunami and wishes to warn the citizens, but the pilots push her away as Coke explains that they are not returning home. At that precise moment, a tsunami strikes the city, killing Kat's wife.